When Princess Isabella stepped onto the emerald polo field that golden afternoon, she never imagined that a single kiss would change everything. The cameras flashed, the crowd roared, and in that moment of pure joy after Prince Alexander's stunning victory, their private love became public spectacle. But behind the fairy tale moment lay a deeper story, one of sacrifice, duty, and the courage to choose love over tradition in a world where every gesture carries the weight of a kingdom. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estate as Princess Isabella adjusted the wide brim of her cream-colored hat. The polo ground stretched before her like a perfectly manicured carpet, with white pavilions dotting the perimeter where Eldoria's elite would soon gather. Today was more than just another polo match. It was the culmination of months of preparation, practice, and quiet determination that had defined her husband's return to the sport he loved. Isabella watched from the clubhouse terrace as Prince Alexander guided his chestnut mare, Tempest, through warm-up exercises. Even from this distance, she could see the focused intensity in his posture. The way he leaned forward slightly in the saddle, completely absorbed in the rhythm of horse and rider moving as one. It had been 2 years since his last competitive match, 2 years since the accident that had nearly ended his polo career and changed everything about their carefully planned royal life. The accident had happened on a rainy Tuesday in March, during what should have been a routine practice session. Alexander's horse had slipped on the wet ground, throwing him hard against the wooden boards that lined the field. The resulting shoulder injury had required 2 surgeries and months of painful rehabilitation. But more than the physical healing, it was the emotional journey that had truly tested their marriage. During those long months of recovery, Isabella had watched her husband struggle with more than just physical pain. Alexander had always defined himself through action. Polo, charitable expeditions, hands-on royal duties that took him far from the gilded halls of palace life. Suddenly confined to desk work and ceremonial appearances, he had grown restless and withdrawn. Their conversations, once filled with shared plans and gentle teasing, became stilted exchanges about schedules and obligations. "Your Royal Highness?" The voice of Margaret Thornton, Isabella's lady-in-waiting, interrupted her thoughts. "The guests are beginning to arrive. The Queen has requested that you greet the tournament sponsors in the royal box." Isabella nodded, taking one last look at Alexander as he practiced his swing. The polo mallet moved in a perfect arc, connecting with the ball with a satisfying crack that carried across the field. Whatever demons he had battled during his recovery, today he looked like the man she had fallen in love with 7 years ago. Confident, graceful, alive with purpose. The royal box filled quickly with the usual collection of dignitaries, wealthy patrons, and social climbers who attended such events. Isabella moved through the crowd with practiced ease, making conversation about the weather, complimenting wives on their fashion choices, and discussing charitable initiatives with the tournament's major donors. But her attention kept drifting to the field, where teams were now taking their positions for the opening ceremony. Alexander rode with the Eldoria Royal team, distinguished by their deep blue jerseys with gold trim. His teammates included Lord Jameson Crawford, a longtime friend and skilled player, Sir Michael Torres, the team captain with over a decade of international experience, and surprisingly, David Chen, a young player from the public leagues whom Alexander had personally recruited despite some raised eyebrows from the polo establishment. The opposing team, Westmore Athletic Club, wore striking red jerseys and boasted some of the most expensive players money could buy. Their captain, Eduardo Santos, was a legendary Argentine player, whose services commanded astronomical fees. The match had been billed as a clash between tradition and commerce, old royal sport versus modern professional athletics. As the teams lined up for the national anthem, Isabella felt the familiar flutter of nerves that always preceded Alexander's matches. She had attended dozens of polo games over the years, but the sport's inherent dangers never stopped worrying her. Players routinely collided at high speeds, horses sometimes fell, and mallets swung with enough force to cause serious injury. After Alexander's accident, these concerns had only intensified. The first chukker began with explosive energy. Both teams charged toward the ball with their mallets raised, horses thundering across the turf in a display of controlled chaos that never failed to thrill spectators. Alexander quickly established himself as a dominant force, his timing and precision clearly undiminished by his time away from competition. Midway through the opening period, he executed a brilliant play that had the crowd on their feet. Riding at full gallop, he managed to hook an opponent's mallet just as they were about to score, steal the ball, and send it flying toward the opposite goal in one fluid motion. David Chen was perfectly positioned to tap it in for the first goal, and as he raised his mallet in celebration, Alexander flashed the broad smile that had first captured Isabella's heart. The royal box erupted in polite but enthusiastic applause. Queen Mother Beatrice, Alexander's grandmother, actually clapped with genuine excitement, a rare display of emotion from the usually reserved monarch. "That grandson of mine hasn't lost a step," she declared to no one in particular, her voice carrying the pride she rarely expressed openly. But Isabella noticed something else in the crowd's reaction. There was surprise, as if people had expected Alexander to struggle in his return to competition. The whispers that had followed his injury, questioning whether he would ever be the same player, whether his confidence had been permanently shaken, seemed to dissipate with that first brilliant play. As the match progressed through its 6 chukkers, Isabella found herself completely absorbed in the action. This was polo at its finest, a chess match played at thunderous speed, requiring split-second decisions, perfect teamwork, and the kind of athletic courage that made ordinary people into legends. Alexander seemed to grow stronger with each period, his partnership with Tempest becoming more seamless, his strategic thinking more sophisticated. The Westmore team proved worthy opponents. Eduardo Santos lived up to his reputation, scoring 3 spectacular goals and demonstrating the kind of ball control that made him one of the highest-paid players in the sport. But the royal team's chemistry, particularly the unexpected partnership between Alexander and David Chen, created opportunities that pure individual skill couldn't match. By the 6th and final chukker, the score stood at 8-7 in favor of Westmore. The tension in the royal box was palpable. Conversations had stopped entirely, and every eye was focused on the field where both teams were giving everything they had. Isabella found herself gripping the rail of the box, her knuckles white with tension. With 2 minutes remaining, Alexander received a pass from Lord Crawford and found himself with a clear path toward goal. But instead of attempting the shot himself, he spotted David Chen in a better position and executed a perfect pass. The young player's shot was true, tying the match at 8 times, precepting the crowd into a frenzy. The final minute felt like an eternity. Both teams created scoring chances, both goalkeepers made spectacular saves, and the tension built to an almost unbearable crescendo. Then, with just seconds remaining, Alexander found himself with the ball again. This time, there was no question of passing. He was 40 yards from goal, with 2 defenders converging on him, but Isabella could see in his posture that he was going to take the shot. The mallet connected with the ball in perfect synchronization with Tempest's stride. The white sphere sailed through the air in a perfect arc, seeming to float for an impossibly long time before passing cleanly between the goalposts just as the final horn sounded. The royal team had won 9-8 in the most dramatic fashion possible. Isabella was already moving before the cheers reached their peak, making her way down from the royal box toward the field. Protocol dictated a certain level of decorum, but in that moment she didn't care about protocol. She had watched her husband overcome his fears, silence his critics, and reclaim the sport that meant so much to him. All she wanted was to reach him and share in his triumph. The champagne reception following the match buzzed with the kind of animated conversation that only follows truly spectacular sport. Alexander stood near the trophy presentation area, still in his polo whites, accepting congratulations from what seemed like half of Eldoria's high society. His hair was damp with sweat, his face flushed with exertion and triumph, but his smile never wavered as he shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with the endless stream of well-wishers. Isabella watched from across the pavilion, nursing a glass of champagne she barely touched. She was proud beyond words, but also acutely aware of how public their lives had become since their marriage. Every gesture was analyzed, every interaction scrutinized for signs of royal approval or disapproval. Even now, she could see photographers positioned at discreet distances, their long lenses capturing candid moments for tomorrow's newspapers. "Quite a show your husband put on today," said a familiar voice beside her. Isabella turned to find Lord Pemberton, one of her father-in-law's oldest friends, and a frequent critic of what he considered the younger generation's departure from royal tradition. His tone was neutral, but she detected a note of surprise, perhaps even grudging respect. "Alexander has always been an exceptional player," Isabella replied diplomatically. "Today simply reminded everyone of that fact." "Yes, well," Pemberton cleared his throat. "There were some who wondered if his enthusiasm for the sport might have been dampened by recent events. I'm pleased to see that isn't the case." Isabella understood the subtext. The accident had provided ammunition for those who believed the royal family should avoid dangerous pursuits, who saw Alexander's polo playing as unnecessarily risky behavior that reflected poorly on the monarchy's sense of responsibility. His triumphant return would silence at least some of those voices. Across the pavilion, she watched Alexander excuse himself from his current conversation and begin making his way toward her. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and she felt the same flutter of attraction that had marked the beginning of their relationship. Even after 7 years together, 3 years of marriage, and countless public appearances, he could still make her heart race with nothing more than a look. "Your Royal Highness," he said formally as he approached, offering a proper bow that was just slightly exaggerated, their private joke about the absurdity of royal protocol in intimate moments. "I trust you enjoyed the match?" "It was adequate," she replied with mock seriousness, fighting to keep a straight face. "Though I noticed several missed opportunities in the third chukker." Alexander's eyes widened in genuine surprise before he caught the teasing glint in her expression. "My apologies, Your Royal Highness. I'll endeavor to do better next time." "See that you do," she said, finally allowing her smile to break through. Though I suppose that final goal was passably dramatic. The formal presentation ceremony began shortly after, with the tournament director calling both teams to center field for the trophy award. Isabella joined the other dignitaries on the small platform that had been erected for the occasion, taking her designated position as the presenting royal. This was the kind of duty she had grown accustomed to. Smile graciously, say a few appropriate words, hand over an ornate piece of silver, and pose for photographs. But as Alexander stepped forward to accept the captain's trophy, something shifted in the atmosphere. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that this moment carried more significance than a typical sporting victory. Camera flashes increased in frequency, and Isabella noticed several television crews adjusting their positions for better angles. Alexander accepted the trophy with both hands, raising it high to acknowledge the crowd's applause. But instead of delivering the standard gracious acceptance speech, he did something unexpected. He handed the trophy to David Chen, the young player whose recruitment had been questioned by polo traditionalists, and began to applaud his teammate. The gesture was simple but powerful. In that moment, Alexander was publicly validating his decision to include a player from outside the establishment, demonstrating that merit mattered more than pedigree. David Chen's face showed a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and pride that was impossible to fake. The crowd's applause grew louder, and Isabella felt a surge of pride in her husband's instinctive understanding of leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander finally spoke into the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the grounds. "This victory belongs to every member of our team, but most especially to David Chen, whose talent and dedication prove that excellence comes from character, not circumstance. Polo has always been called the sport of kings, but today we were reminded that true royalty lies in how we treat one another." The speech was brief but perfectly pitched. Alexander had managed to acknowledge tradition while embracing change, to honor the sport's heritage while opening doors for its future. Isabella could see approval in faces throughout the crowd, including some who had been skeptical of his return to competitive play. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Alexander made his way back to Isabella's side. But instead of the private moment she expected, they found themselves immediately surrounded by reporters requesting interviews, photographers asking for poses, and officials scheduling follow-up appearances. "Your Royal Highnesses," called James Morrison, the royal correspondent for the Eldoria Telegraph, "could we have a few words about today's victory and what it means for Prince Alexander's return to competitive polo?" Isabella felt Alexander tense slightly beside her. Media interactions were always carefully managed affairs, with questions pre-approved and responses crafted to avoid controversy. But the spontaneous nature of their current situation left little room for the usual preparations. "Today was about sport at its finest," Alexander replied carefully. "Good horses, skilled players, and the kind of competition that brings out everyone's best efforts. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate and proud of how our team performed." "And Your Royal Highness," Morrison continued, turning to Isabella, "how did it feel to watch your husband's return to competitive play after his injury?" The question was innocent enough, but Isabella sensed the trap. Any display of emotion could be interpreted as either weakness or insincerity. Too much concern might suggest she thought Alexander was reckless. Too little might make her seem cold and unsupportive. "I have complete confidence in Prince Alexander's judgment and abilities," she said smoothly. Today's performance certainly justified that confidence, but even as she spoke, Isabella realized how formal and distant her words sounded. This was the perpetual challenge of royal life, the need to be simultaneously authentic and appropriate, personal yet dignified, relatable, while maintaining mystique. The interview continued for several more minutes, covering the technical aspects of the match, plans for future tournaments, and the charitable foundation that would benefit from the day's proceeds. Throughout it all, Isabella was acutely aware of maintaining the proper distance from Alexander, of keeping her expressions neutral, of following the unspoken rules that governed every public appearance. Finally, their security detail began creating space for their departure. The crowds parted respectfully, allowing them to make their way toward the waiting cars that would transport them back to Kensington Palace for the private celebration dinner that had been planned weeks in advance. But as they walked across the grass, something unexpected happened. A group of children who had been watching from the public areas broke through the barriers and ran toward them, clutching programs and small flags, their faces bright with excitement at seeing real royalty up close. Security moved to intercept them, but Alexander raised his hand to indicate they should allow the approach. "Hello there," he said warmly to the children, kneeling down to their level despite his formal polo attire. "Did you enjoy the match?" The children erupted into excited chatter, sharing their favorite moments and asking questions about the horses. Isabella found herself charmed by their unfiltered enthusiasm and touched by Alexander's patient attention to each child. This was the man she had fallen in love with, not the formal prince required by protocol, but the genuinely caring person who instinctively connected with others. One little girl, perhaps 6 years old, looked up at Isabella with wide eyes. "Are you a real princess?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. "I am," Isabella replied, kneeling down beside Alexander. "What's your name?" "Sophie," the girl replied shyly. "My mummy says you live in a castle." "I do live in a palace," Isabella confirmed, "but it's not quite like the castles in fairy tales. There are no dragons or towers where princesses wait to be rescued." "Do you rescue yourself?" Sophie asked seriously. The question caught Isabella off guard, but she found herself smiling genuinely for the first time all day. "I try to," she said. "And sometimes my prince helps me, and sometimes I help him." Alexander looked at her with surprise and something else, perhaps admiration for her honest answer to the child's innocent question. Their eyes met over Sophie's head, and Isabella felt a connection that had been missing during the formal parts of the day. The moment was interrupted by their security detail, who gently but firmly indicated that it was time to move toward the cars. The children were escorted back to their families, clutching autographs and glowing with excitement at their encounter with royalty. As they finally settled into the car for the drive back to London, Isabella felt the day's events settling into perspective. Alexander's triumph on the polo field was significant, but the spontaneous interaction with the children had reminded her why they had chosen public service despite its constraints and complications. "That was well done with the children," she said quietly as their motorcade pulled away from Willowbrook Estate. "They were sweet," Alexander replied, loosening his tie and running a hand through his hair. "Sometimes I forget what it's like to talk to people who aren't calculating political advantage in every conversation." Isabella nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Royal life could become a series of performed interactions, each carefully choreographed to achieve specific objectives. Genuine human connection became precious precisely because it was so rare. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching the countryside roll past through tinted windows. Isabella found herself thinking about Sophie's question about rescuing herself. It wasn't something she had ever articulated, but she realized that much of her adult life had been about learning to maintain her identity while fulfilling her royal duties. The private dinner at Kensington Palace that evening was intended to be an intimate celebration, but Isabella found herself struggling to shake the formal atmosphere that seemed to follow them everywhere. The dining room, with its 18th-century portraits and crystal chandeliers, felt impossibly grand even for a gathering of just 12 people. Alexander's parents, his sister Princess Charlotte, a few close friends, and the core members of the polo team. King Edward and Queen Margaret had arrived earlier than expected, bringing with them the inevitable shift in dynamics that accompanied the monarch's presence. Conversations became more measured, jokes more carefully considered, and the easy camaraderie that Isabella had hoped to foster never quite materialized. "Alexander played magnificently today," Queen Margaret was saying to Lord Crawford's wife. "Though I must admit I held my breath during that final charge toward goal. One forgets how dangerous the sport can be until you're watching someone you care about racing across the field at such speeds." Isabella caught Alexander's slight wince at his mother's words. The accident was still a sensitive topic, despite his triumphant return to form. Any mention of Polo's dangers seemed to remind everyone of the months of uncertainty that had followed his injury. Princess Charlotte, sensing the tension, smoothly changed the subject. Did you see David Chen's face when Alexander handed in the trophy? I thought the poor boy might faint from shock. He earned it, Alexander said firmly. His play in the final 3 chukkers was what won us the match. I may have scored the decisive goal, but David created the opportunities that made it possible. King Edward nodded approvingly. Leadership is about recognizing others' contributions. You did well to highlight his role in the victory. The conversation continued in this vein, touching on various aspects of the match, upcoming charitable commitments, and the social dynamics of the polo world. Isabella participated when appropriate, but found her attention drifting to the interplay of personalities around the table. Sir Michael Torres, the team captain, was regaling the group with stories from his playing days in Argentina, where polo was practically a religion, and matches drew crowds of 50,000 spectators. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Isabella noticed Alexander becoming more animated as they discussed the technical aspects of different playing styles. The key, Torres was explaining, is understanding that polo is really 4 separate games happening simultaneously. Each player has their designated role, but the best teams blur those boundaries when opportunities arise. Today, Alexander showed the kind of strategic flexibility that separates good players from great ones. David Chen, who had been quietly overwhelmed by dining in the palace, finally found his voice. I've never experienced anything like that final minute, he said. When Prince Alexander passed me the ball in the 5th chukker, I knew he was trusting me with the team's success. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Trust is earned, Alexander replied. You've been outplaying men with twice your experience all season. Today you simply did it on a bigger stage. Isabella was struck by the genuine warmth in her husband's voice when he spoke to David. This was Alexander at his best, encouraging others, building confidence, using his position to lift people up rather than maintain distance. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with him, despite the complications that came with royal life. As the main course was cleared and dessert served, the conversation naturally fragmented into smaller groups. Isabella found herself talking with Princess Charlotte about an upcoming charitable foundation event, while Alexander continued his animated discussion of polo strategy with the players. You look thoughtful tonight, Charlotte observed quietly. Everything all right? Isabella considered how to answer. Charlotte was not only Alexander's sister, but had become one of her closest friends, someone who understood the unique pressures of royal life from personal experience. But even with Charlotte, there were aspects of marriage that felt too private to share. Just processing the day, I suppose, Isabella said finally. It's been quite a journey, watching Alexander work his way back to competitive form. There were times during his recovery when I wasn't sure he would find his passion for the sport again. Charlotte nodded, understanding. He was different during those months, wasn't he? More withdrawn. Mother was quite worried, though she'd never admit it. He questioned everything, Isabella said, surprising herself with her honesty. Not just whether he could play polo again, but whether he should. There were people suggesting he was being irresponsible, that royal duties should take precedence over personal pursuits. And what did you tell him? Isabella smiled, remembering the conversation that had marked a turning point in Alexander's recovery. I told him that duty without passion becomes mere performance, that the country needs leaders who pursue excellence in whatever form it takes, not just people who show up and go through the motions. Wise advice, Charlotte said, though I imagine it wasn't easy to watch him struggle with the decision. It hadn't been easy. Isabella remembered nights when Alexander would stare out their bedroom window toward the polo grounds, his shoulder aching from physical therapy, his confidence shaken by months away from competition. She had watched him wrestle with self-doubt in a way that seemed almost incomprehensible for someone who had always excelled at everything he attempted. The turning point had come during a particularly difficult physical therapy session. Alexander's shoulder had seized up during what should have been a routine exercise, sending him into a fury of frustration that had been building for weeks. He had thrown his exercise equipment across the room and declared that perhaps everyone was right. Perhaps it was time to give up polo and focus on being a proper royal. Isabella had let him vent his anger and disappointment before quietly asking a single question. Who are you if you're not someone who pursues what matters to you? That question had hung in the air between them for a long moment before Alexander had begun to cry. Not tears of pain or frustration, but tears of recognition. He was someone who had always defined himself through action and achievement. Without polo, without the pursuit of excellence in something he loved, he felt diminished and lost. From that day forward, his approach to recovery had changed. Instead of focusing on whether he could return to his previous level of play, he began working toward becoming the best player he could be with his current limitations. The difference in perspective had transformed not just his physical rehabilitation, but his entire outlook on life. "Your Royal Highnesses," the butler announced, "coffee and brandy are being served in the drawing room." The party moved to the more comfortable setting of the drawing room, where a fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, and deep leather chairs invited more relaxed conversation. Alexander settled into his favorite chair near the window, and Isabella was pleased when David Chen overcame his nervousness enough to join the conversation circle.
"I have to ask," King Edward said to David, "what was it like growing up playing polo in the public leagues?"
"I imagine the experience was quite different from the traditional club system." David smiled, seeming to relax slightly. "Very different, Your Majesty. We played on fields that weren't always perfectly maintained, with equipment that was passed down through generations, that there was something pure about it. Nobody was there for social reasons or business connections. Everyone just loved the sport. That purity is something we shouldn't lose sight of," Alexander added. "When I was choosing teammates for this season, I wasn't interested in pedigree or social connections. I wanted players who brought passion and skill to the game." Isabella noticed the subtle but significant statement Alexander was making. By recruiting David and publicly defending his decision, he was using his royal platform to challenge the exclusivity that had traditionally defined polo. It was the kind of thoughtful leadership that made her proud to be his wife. The evening wound down gradually, with guests beginning to make their departures around 10 o'clock. The polo players were among the first to leave, with early training sessions awaiting them the next morning. David Chen approached Isabella and Alexander together to express his gratitude. "Thank you both for including me today," he said formally. "Not just on the team, but in this celebration. It means more than you know." "You've earned your place," Alexander replied. "Today's victory belongs to you as much as anyone." After David left, Isabella watched him through the window as he walked toward his modest car parked among the luxury vehicles of other guests. There was something poignant about seeing him return to his normal life after a day of royal treatment, and she found herself hoping that Alexander's mentorship would open doors for him beyond just polo. By 11 o'clock, only family remained. King Edward and Queen Margaret were preparing to return to Windsor Castle, while Charlotte lingered over her brandy, clearly enjoying the rare opportunity for informal family time. "Well done today, son," the king said to Alexander as they prepared to say goodbye. "Not just the polo, but the way you conducted yourself afterward. You represented the family well." Isabella could see how much the approval meant to Alexander, even as an adult who had long since proven himself capable of independent judgment. The relationship between royal children and their parents carried unique complexities, with personal pride always intertwined with public duty. After the king and queen departed, the three younger royals settled back into comfortable conversation. This was the kind of evening Isabella treasured. No formal protocol, no public scrutiny, just family sharing stories and enjoying each other's company. "I have a confession," Charlotte said, curling up in her chair with her brandy snifter. "I was terrified during that final chukker. I kept thinking about what would happen if Alexander got hurt again, how it would affect not just him but the entire family." Alexander looked surprised by his sister's admission. "I never thought about the pressure my playing puts on all of you." "We don't want you to think about it," Isabella said quickly. "Your happiness matters more than our nerves." "But Charlotte's right, we do worry." "The thing is," Charlotte continued, "watching you play today reminded me why you love it so much. There's something magical about seeing you completely in your element, doing something that brings you pure joy. We see so little of that in royal life, moments when duty and passion align perfectly." Isabella nodded, understanding exactly what Charlotte meant. Most royal engagements were performances of duty, important but rarely fulfilling, on a personal level. Polo was different for Alexander. It was where his public role and private passions intersected in a way that made both more meaningful. They talked for another hour, sharing memories of polo matches from previous years, discussing upcoming charitable events, and simply enjoying the comfortable intimacy of family conversation. Isabella felt the tensions of the day slowly dissolving, replaced by a sense of contentment that had been missing during the more formal celebrations. Finally, Charlotte announced that she should return to her own apartment. As she prepared to leave, she hugged both Isabella and Alexander warmly. "Today was perfect," she told them. "Not just the polo, but seeing you both so happy together. Sometimes I think we forget how to be ourselves in all the royal performance. Today felt real." After Charlotte left, Alexander and Isabella were finally alone for the first time since the morning. They stood together in the drawing room, The fire now reduced to glowing embers, the candles burned low, and the formal atmosphere of the dinner party completely dissipated. "Come here," Alexander said softly, opening his arms to her. Isabella moved into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers, breathing in the familiar scent that was uniquely his. They held each other in comfortable silence, both processing the events of a day that had been more significant than either had initially realized. "I'm proud of you," she whispered against his chest. "Not just for winning, but for the way you handled everything today. The speech, the children, David Chen. You were exactly the kind of leader the country needs." Alexander pulled back slightly to look at her face. "I couldn't have done any of it without you. During all those months when I was questioning everything, you never stopped believing I would find my way back." "I never doubted you," Isabella said truthfully. "I worried about you, I hurt for you, but I never doubted that you would emerge stronger from the experience." They stood together for a few more moments, both understanding that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obligations, new opportunities to serve their country and their people. But tonight was theirs alone, a private celebration of triumph that felt all the more precious for being genuine rather than performed. The morning after the Polo victory dawned grey and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to cast everything in muted tones. Isabella woke before Alexander, as was her habit, and spent a few quiet moments watching him sleep. In repose, his face had lost the careful composure that public life required, and she could see traces of the young man she had first met at a charity gala 7 years ago. Their relationship had begun in the most unlikely way, a heated argument about environmental policy at a reception for young philanthropists. Alexander had been defending a controversial development project, while Isabella, then working for a conservation nonprofit, had challenged him with facts and figures that clearly caught him off guard. Instead of being offended by her directness, he had been intrigued by her passion and expertise. "Your Royal Highness," she had said at the end of their debate, using his title with just a hint of irony, "perhaps you should spend more time talking to people who disagree with you." "Perhaps I should," he had replied with a smile that transformed his entire face.
"Are you available for dinner tomorrow?" That dinner had lasted 4 hours, ranging from environmental policy to art history to their shared love of horses.
Isabella had been struck by Alexander's genuine curiosity about topics beyond his royal upbringing, while he had been fascinated by her experience working with communities affected by climate change.
Their courtship had been conducted largely in secret for the first year, with Isabella continuing her environmental work while Alexander fulfilled his royal duties. They had met in small restaurants far from London, taken long walks in the countryside, and talked for hours about their dreams and fears. It had been the most romantic year of Isabella's life, but also the most challenging, as she grappled with what it would mean to give up her career for royal duty. Now, 3 years into their marriage, Isabella sometimes wondered if she had lost too much of herself in the transition to royal life. Her environmental work had been reduced to ceremonial appearances and carefully scripted speeches. Her opinions had to be filtered through protocol officers who ensured she never said anything that might be interpreted as political. Alexander stirred beside her, slowly emerging from sleep with the confused expression he always wore in the morning. "What time is it?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Just after 7, Isabella replied softly. "The papers should be arriving soon." It was a Sunday morning ritual they both dreaded and anticipated. The British press would have extensive coverage of yesterday's polo match, complete with photographs, analysis, and inevitably, speculation about various aspects of their public appearance. Isabella had learned to skim the articles quickly, absorbing the necessary information, while trying not to let criticism or praise affect her too deeply. Alexander sat up in bed, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I suppose we should see what damage the press has done to yesterday's victory." 20 minutes later, they sat in their private breakfast room, with coffee, toast, and a collection of Sunday newspapers spread across the table. The coverage was extensive and largely positive, with several papers featuring photographs from the match on their front pages. Isabella was relieved to see that the focus remained on the sporting achievement rather than hunting for controversy. "Look at this," Alexander said, holding up the Sunday Times sports section. "They're calling it the Prince's Return and comparing it to famous comebacks in sporting history." Isabella glanced at the article, which included quotes from polo experts praising Alexander's technical skill and strategic thinking. There was also a sidebar about David Chen, describing his background and suggesting that his inclusion on the royal team represented a positive evolution in the sport's traditionally exclusive culture. But it was the society pages that made Isabella's stomach tighten with anxiety. There, alongside photographs of various attendees in their elegant attire, was a large colour image of her and Alexander after the match. They were standing close together, both smiling genuinely, caught in what appeared to be an intimate moment of shared triumph. The photograph was lovely, but Isabella could already anticipate the analysis it would provoke. Royal watchers would study their body language for signs of marital harmony or discord. Fashion critics would examine her outfit choice. Protocol experts would evaluate whether their behavior had been appropriately dignified for the occasion. "We look happy," Alexander observed, studying the same photograph. "That's not always easy to achieve in public settings." Isabella nodded, remembering how natural it had felt to share that moment with him. The genuine joy of his victory had temporarily stripped away the usual layers of royal performance, leaving them simply as a husband and wife celebrating together. The telephone rang, interrupting their newspaper review. It was Margaret Thornton, Isabella's lady-in-waiting, calling to review the day's schedule and discuss media requests that had come in overnight. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, "there are 17 interview requests, 12 requests for photographs, and 3 television programs asking if you and Prince Alexander would appear to discuss yesterday's match." Isabella sighed. This was the inevitable aftermath of any significant royal event, a flurry of media attention that had to be carefully managed to maintain the right balance of accessibility and mystique. "Please coordinate with Prince Alexander's office," Isabella replied. "We'll do 1 print interview and 1 television appearance, but nothing more this week. We don't want to overexpose the story." After hanging up, she found Alexander already on his own phone with his private secretary, having a similar conversation about managing the media response to his polo victory. This was the machinery of royal life. Every public moment required careful follow-up to maximize positive exposure while avoiding pitfalls. When both calls were finished, they returned to their breakfast and newspapers in comfortable silence. But Isabella's mind was elsewhere, thinking about the conversation with Charlotte the night before, and the question of authenticity in royal life. "Alexander," she said eventually, "do you ever miss who you were before you became a public figure?" He looked up from the sports pages with surprise. "What do you mean?"
I mean the person you were when we first met.
The man who could argue about environmental policy without worrying about political implications, who could express opinions without having them filtered through 3 different advisors. Alexander set down his newspaper and gave her his full attention. This was a conversation they had touched on before but never fully explored, perhaps because the implications were too complex to resolve easily. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "especially during the months after my accident, when I had time to reflect on what really mattered to me. But I'm not sure that person ever really existed independently of my royal identity." Isabella understood what he meant. Alexander had been raised from birth to fulfill his royal role, educated and trained with that purpose always in mind. Even his most spontaneous moments were shaped by an awareness of his public position. "But you must have dreams and desires that are purely your own," she pressed. "Things you would pursue if duty weren't a factor." Alexander considered this carefully. "I suppose I've always wondered what it would be like to work directly with conservation organizations, to spend months in remote locations doing hands-on environmental research. But that's exactly the kind of thing that becomes complicated when you're royal." Isabella felt a pang of recognition. Her own environmental work had been curtailed for similar reasons. Royal family members couldn't be seen as advocating for specific policies or organizations, no matter how worthy the cause. "Sometimes I think we've traded our individual purposes for a kind of collective significance that may be less fulfilling," she said. "But yesterday felt different," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "Playing polo at that level, with teammates who respected my skill rather than my title, pursuing excellence for its own sake, that felt authentic in a way that many royal duties don't." Isabella nodded. This was what had made yesterday's victory so meaningful. It was one of the few areas where Alexander could compete and succeed based entirely on merit, where his royal status was secondary to his abilities. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their security team, who briefed them on the day's movements and potential security concerns. This was another aspect of royal life that Isabella sometimes found oppressive. The constant awareness that their safety required vigilance, that they could never move through the world with complete freedom. After the security briefing, they had an hour of private time before their first official engagement of the day, a visit to a children's hospital, where Isabella would officially open a new wing funded by one of their charitable foundations. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work that made royal duty worthwhile, but Isabella found herself wishing she could spend more time with the patients and less time with photographers and administrators. I keep thinking about that little girl yesterday, Isabella said as they prepared to leave. Sophie, who asked if I rescue myself. What about her? She assumed that being a princess meant waiting to be rescued. But then she seemed genuinely interested when I suggested that I rescue myself. It made me wonder what kind of example we're setting for children who look up to us. Alexander paused in adjusting his tie. What kind of example do you think we should be setting? That we use our privilege to pursue meaningful work, that we take risks for things we believe in, that we're more than just ceremonial figures who show up and look appropriately royal. Like including David Chen on the polo team despite criticism from traditionalists? Exactly like that, Isabella said, feeling excited by the direction of their conversation. You used your platform to challenge exclusivity and promote merit-based selection. It was a small act, but it demonstrated values that matter. Alexander smiled, and Isabella saw a spark of the idealism that had first attracted her to him. You know, there might be ways to do more of that kind of thing. To use our positions more actively to promote changes we believe in. This was dangerous territory. Royal family members were expected to remain politically neutral and avoid controversial positions. But Isabella felt a thrill of possibility at the idea of using their influence more purposefully. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their motorcade, but Isabella carried the excitement of possibility with her as they traveled toward the hospital. Perhaps there were ways to be more authentically themselves while still fulfilling their royal duties. Perhaps yesterday's polo victory was just the beginning of a larger journey toward finding meaning and purpose within the constraints of their public roles. The hospital visit went smoothly, with Isabella managing to spend genuine time with patients despite the media attention. She was particularly moved by a 12-year-old girl named Emma who was recovering from a serious accident. Emma reminded Isabella of herself at that age. Serious, thoughtful, determined to make a difference in the world. What do you want to be when you grow up? Isabella asked Emma during a quiet moment away from the cameras. A doctor, Emma replied without hesitation. I want to help kids who are scared and hurt, like the doctors here help me. That's a wonderful goal, Isabella said. Never let anyone tell you it's not possible. Emma studied Isabella's face seriously. Did people tell you that you couldn't be a princess? The question caught Isabella off guard, but she found herself answering honestly. I wasn't born a princess. I became one when I married Prince Alexander. Before that, I worked to protect the environment and help communities affected by climate change. Do you still do that work? Isabella hesitated, aware that their conversation might be overheard by the hovering media. I try to, but in different ways now. Sometimes being royal means finding new ways to help people. Emma nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense to her. Maybe you can rescue yourself by helping other people rescue themselves. The wisdom of children never failed to amaze Isabella. Emma had instinctively understood something that Isabella herself was still working to articulate, that true fulfillment might come from using their privileged position to empower others rather than simply performing ceremonial duties. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Isabella found herself energized rather than drained by the visit. This was what royal life could be at its best. Meaningful connections with people, the ability to bring attention and resources to important causes, the platform to inspire and encourage others. During the ride back to the palace, she shared Emma's insight with Alexander, who was equally struck by the girl's perspective. She's right, he said thoughtfully. Maybe the key is finding ways to rescue ourselves by helping others rescue themselves, using our platform to create opportunities rather than just making appearances. Isabella felt a surge of excitement at the possibilities this perspective opened up. Perhaps they could find ways to be more authentically themselves while still serving the greater good. Perhaps yesterday's polo victory was indeed the beginning of something larger, a journey toward a more purposeful and fulfilling approach to royal duty. 3 weeks after the polo victory, Isabella stood in the morning room at Kensington Palace, reviewing correspondence with Margaret Thornton. The initial media attention had settled into a more manageable rhythm. But the impact of Alexander's triumph continued to ripple through various aspects of their public life in unexpected ways. Your Royal Highness, Margaret said, holding up a thick folder. We've received over 200 letters from young people asking about opportunities to get involved in polo. Most are from backgrounds similar to David Chen's. Talented athletes from public programs who previously had no access to elite-level competition. Isabella smiled, remembering Alexander's prediction that his recruitment of David would inspire other young players. What she hadn't anticipated was the administrative challenge of responding to so much interest while actually creating meaningful opportunities. Have you coordinated with Prince Alexander's office about establishing some kind of program? Yes, ma'am. His private secretary suggests creating a formal scholarship program, but that would require significant fundraising and administrative infrastructure. Alternatively, they could work with existing organizations to expand access to coaching and facilities. Isabella considered the options while gazing out at the palace gardens, where autumn was painting the trees in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. This was exactly the kind of initiative that could make their royal platform more meaningful. Using Alexander's success to create lasting change rather than simply enjoying momentary glory. Let's schedule a meeting with the prince to discuss this properly, she decided, and research what similar programs exist in other sports. I'd rather do something substantial than make promises we can't keep. After Margaret left, Isabella had an hour before her next engagement, a visit to a secondary school in East London, where she would discuss environmental issues with students. It was part of her ongoing effort to maintain some connection to the conservation work that had once defined her life, though she sometimes felt like she was performing a watered-down version of her former expertise. Alexander found her in the morning room, still in his polo practice clothes after an early training session. Even 3 weeks after the match, he was maintaining an intensive training schedule, preparing for upcoming tournaments, and clearly energized by his return to competitive form. Margaret mentioned the scholarship letters, he said, settling into the chair across from her. I've been thinking about this constantly since David mentioned how many talented players never get opportunities to develop their skills. It's a wonderful problem to have, Isabella replied, but we need to be thoughtful about how we respond. Creating false hope would be worse than doing nothing. Alexander nodded seriously. I have been talking to Sir Michael about existing programs in Argentina and the United States. The most successful ones combine financial support with mentorship and access to quality facilities. It's not just about money. These young players need coaching, equipment, and most importantly, acceptance into a community that hasn't always been welcoming to outsiders. Isabella was struck by the sophistication of his thinking about the issue. This was Alexander at his best, combining his passion for the sport with genuine concern for social equity, using his privileged position to create opportunities for others. What kind of commitment are we talking about? She asked. Both financially and in terms of your time. That's what I've been wrestling with, Alexander admitted. To do this properly would require significant ongoing involvement, not just funding but personal mentorship, advocacy within the Polo establishment, and probably some uncomfortable conversations with people who prefer the status quo. Isabella understood the implications. Royal family members were expected to maintain cordial relationships across the social spectrum, avoiding positions that might alienate important constituencies. Challenging the exclusive nature of polo could create tensions with traditional supporters. Are you prepared for that kind of controversy? She asked gently. Alexander was quiet for a moment, staring out at the gardens. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't sure. But yesterday, I received a letter from a 15-year-old girl in Manchester whose local riding school is closing due to lack of funding. She's been playing polo for 2 years and has real talent, but she'll have nowhere to practice or compete if we don't find solutions. He pulled a handwritten letter from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. Listen to this. Your Royal Highness, I know polo is supposed to be for rich people, but I love it more than anything else in my life. Watching you play with David Chen on television made me believe that maybe someone like me could have a chance. Please don't let people like me disappear from the sport. Isabella felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was why their public platform mattered, not for the ceremonial aspects or the social prestige, but for the ability to inspire hope and create real change in people's lives. Her name is Sarah Mitchell, Alexander continued. I've already contacted the riding school to discuss emergency funding while we develop something more comprehensive. But Isabella, I can't just help one girl and ignore hundreds of others in similar situations. Then we don't, Isabella said firmly. We figure out how to help as many as possible, and we accept whatever criticism comes with that choice. Alexander looked at her with surprise and gratitude. You understand this could complicate other aspects of our royal duties? Some traditionalists won't appreciate us challenging the established order. Good, Isabella replied with more vehemence than she had intended. Maybe it's time we stopped worrying so much about offending people who benefit from excluding others. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the implications of the commitment they were contemplating. This would be more than a charitable donation or ceremonial support. It would be active advocacy for systemic change in a traditional sport. There's something else, Alexander said eventually. David Chen asked if I would consider coaching young players during the off-season. He's been working with kids at his old riding school, and he thinks my involvement could help legitimize their program and attract additional resources. Isabella smiled, imagining Alexander working with children who shared his passion for polo but lacked his privileged background. That sounds perfect. Nothing would demonstrate your commitment more clearly than spending your own time developing young talent. It would mean traveling to different cities, working with riding schools in areas that aren't exactly traditional royal venues, Alexander warned. Some of the facilities are pretty basic compared to what we're used to. Even better, Isabella said. It would show that you're genuinely committed to the sport rather than just the glamorous aspects. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Isabella's security team, signaling that it was time to leave for the school visit. But as she gathered her things, Isabella felt energized by the possibility of using their platform for meaningful change. The school visit proved to be more engaging than usual. The students in East London were refreshingly direct in their questions about environmental issues, challenging Isabella to move beyond talking points to substantive discussion of policy implications. "Your Royal Highness," asked a 16-year-old named Marcus, "why don't you just tell the government to ban single-use plastics? You're royal. Don't you have influence?" Isabella smiled at his assumption that royal influence worked so directly. "It's not quite that simple, Marcus. Royal family members don't make government policy, but we can use our platform to raise awareness and support organizations working for change." That sounds like a polite way of saying you don't want to rock the boat, another student, Fatima, observed with typical teenage bluntness. The comment stung because it contained more truth than Isabella was comfortable acknowledging. How many times had she softened her environmental advocacy to avoid political controversy? How many opportunities for real influence had she sacrificed to maintain royal neutrality? "You're not entirely wrong," Isabella admitted, surprising the students with her honesty. "Sometimes we do choose diplomacy over direct action, but I'm wondering if there might be ways to be more effective while still fulfilling our constitutional role." The students perked up at this suggestion, sensing an opportunity to push for more concrete commitments. They spent the next hour discussing specific environmental challenges facing their community and brainstorming ways the royal platform could support local solutions. By the time Isabella returned to the palace, she was carrying a notebook full of ideas and a renewed sense of purpose. The students had reminded her why she had been passionate about environmental work in the first place, the urgency of the challenges and the possibility of making a real difference. Alexander was waiting for her in their private sitting room, surrounded by papers and laptop computers. He had clearly spent the afternoon researching polo development programs and working on concrete proposals for their scholarship initiative. "How did the school visit go?" he asked, looking up from his work. "Enlightening," Isabella replied, settling into the chair beside him. "The students challenged me to think more boldly about using our platform for environmental advocacy. They made me realize I've been too cautious, too worried about maintaining neutrality at the expense of effectiveness." Alexander nodded, understanding. "I've been having similar thoughts about the polo program. We could play it safe and just provide some modest funding through existing organizations. Or we could be more ambitious and actually challenge the sport's exclusivity." "What's the more ambitious option look like?" Alexander's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Full scholarships for talented players from non-traditional backgrounds, including coaching, equipment, competition fees, and travel expenses. But more than that, actively working to change the culture of polo clubs, advocating for inclusion, and using our participation in tournaments to highlight these issues." Isabella felt a thrill of excitement at the scope of his vision. That would definitely generate controversy. Probably. But this morning I received 3 more letters from young players who feel shut out of the sport they love. I can't keep ignoring their potential just to avoid uncomfortable conversations with establishment figures. They spent the next 2 hours developing detailed plans for both initiatives, Alexander's polo scholarship program and Isabella's expanded environmental advocacy. By evening, they had outlined approaches that would be more direct and substantive than their previous charitable work, but also more likely to generate criticism. "Are we ready for this?" Isabella asked as they reviewed their plans over dinner. "It's going to change how people see us, how the media covers us, maybe how the palace views our role." Alexander reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you remember what you told me during my recovery? That duty without passion becomes mere performance?" Isabella nodded, remembering the conversation that had marked a turning point in Alexander's rehabilitation. "I think we've been performing royal duty rather than living it," Alexander continued. "Yesterday's polo match reminded me what it feels like to pursue excellence in something that matters.
These programs could give us that same sense of purpose in our public roles.
Isabella squeezed his hand, feeling the same sense of possibility that had marked the early days of their relationship.
Then let's do it properly. Let's use our privilege to create real opportunities for others, even if it means challenging people who prefer things the way they are. As they finalized their plans, Isabella thought about Sophie, the little girl at the polo match who had asked if she rescued herself. Perhaps true royal leadership meant helping others rescue themselves, creating opportunities, challenging barriers, and using their platform to advocate for equity rather than just maintaining tradition. The next morning brought a flurry of meetings as they began implementing their more ambitious approach to royal duty. Alexander met with Polo officials to discuss inclusion initiatives, while Isabella scheduled conversations with environmental organizations about more direct advocacy roles. By afternoon, they were both exhausted but energized by the possibilities ahead. As they sat in their private garden reviewing the day's progress, Isabella reflected on how much had changed since the polo victory 3 weeks earlier. "That kiss on the polo field started something bigger than we realized," she said thoughtfully. Alexander smiled, remembering the spontaneous moment of celebration that had been captured by photographers and shared around the world. It was just happiness, pure and simple. No calculation, no performance, just genuine joy that I wanted to share with you. Maybe that's what we've been missing in our public roles, Isabella mused. Moments of genuine emotion and authentic purpose rather than carefully managed appearances. As the sun set over London, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Isabella felt optimistic about their future in a way she hadn't for months. The polo victory had been just the beginning, a reminder of what they could accomplish when passion and duty aligned. Now they had the opportunity to build something more substantial, using their platform to create lasting change rather than just making appearances. The road ahead would certainly bring challenges and criticism, but for the first time in years, Isabella felt like they were pursuing a version of royal duty that honored both their public responsibilities and their personal values. The little girl who had asked about rescuing herself would have been proud. They were learning to rescue themselves by helping others do the same. 3 months later, Alexander's Polo Scholarship program had provided full support to 12 young players from diverse backgrounds, while Isabella's environmental advocacy had helped secure funding for 3 major conservation projects. The criticism had indeed come, but so had support from unexpected quarters and, more importantly, real results that made the controversy worthwhile. Most significantly, they had discovered a way to be authentically themselves while serving the greater good, using their privilege not to maintain distance from ordinary concerns, but to create extraordinary opportunities for others. The polo field kiss had been captured in a single photograph, but the love story it represented was still being written, one meaningful action at a time.